Afternoon and welcome back to Colossians. Today we're going to think about Colossians 3 verses 12 to 14 and you can follow along on the screen. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. When someone becomes a follower of Jesus, their life always changes. When someone receives Jesus as Lord and recognizes his lordship over their life and says, I want to follow Jesus, their life always changes. Whenever someone receives the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit starts to work in your life, bringing you to faith and then helping you to grow, your life always changes. It doesn't happen overnight and the change isn't as quick as we would like it to be, but there is still change that takes place as God molds and shapes and makes us more and more like Jesus. Elsewhere in the Bible and here in Colossians, we're told that Christians will have a new attitude towards sin. Christians will see sin for what it really is. Sin is not harmless fun. Sin is not God's trying to spoil our fun or steal our joy. Sin is dangerous. Sin is destructive. And we see the danger of sin and the destructive power of sin in the fact that Jesus came to earth to die on a cross to pay for our sin, to do away with the curse of sin. Christians see sin for what it is. Christians recognize that they have been set free from the power of sin through the death of Christ. And now as people who have been set free, how can we also now not hate sin the way God hates sin? In the previous verses, Paul commanded the Colossians to put to death what remained of their earthly nature, to rid themselves of the things that were sinful, that are now not appropriate and weren't appropriate for the people of God. And I wonder at this stage, can you think of any sinful habits? As we've thought about this section of Colossians, is there anything that God has been challenging you about, that he's challenging you to throw off, to get rid of, or to put to death? If that's the case, I want to encourage you to do that, because sin is destructive, sin is dangerous, and it honours God when we put sin to death as believers. We're called to get rid of sin in our lives, and we're also called in this passage to put on the new self. In verse 12, Paul reminded the Colossians that they were God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. And that's the same for all believers. That's the same for you and I. We are God's chosen people. We are holy and we are dearly loved by God. And then Paul challenged them to clothe themselves with compassion, kindness, gentleness, and patience. Here we have the idea of taking off an old, dirty, worn out set of clothes. Think of the kind of clothes you would wear if you're working outside or you're doing something where you don't care about getting dirty, like at summer week or something like that. It's the idea of taking off clothes like that are dirty, that are worn out, and putting on new clothes. So I don't know what your best gear is, but whatever you would say is your best clothes, putting them on, even better. It's the idea of God taking off our old clothes and replacing them and giving us new clothes to wear, clothes that reflect him and his glory. We're called in verse 13 to forgive others as God has forgiven us. Forgiveness can be really hard sometimes, especially when someone has really hurt us. And I don't know if you can think of times when either you have had to forgive someone else or you've asked someone else for forgiveness, but it's awkward, it's hard. But it becomes a wee bit easier when we think about what Paul is referencing here. Paul is referencing the fact that we will never be called to forgive someone else for more than God has already forgiven us. We have been forgiven by God for a far greater debt than anything else that we will have to forgive anyone else for, if that makes sense. The debt that we had and owed to God will always be greater than any debt that anyone else owes us in this life. And so we forgive because we have been forgiven. We have received the forgiveness of God and we're called to pass that forgiveness on to other people. And if there's someone in your life that you know God is calling you to forgive, I would encourage you to do that. Forgive as God has forgiven you. And lastly, we're told to put on love. Love is the centerpiece of this new set of clothes that we have been given. Love is like the belt. We're told it binds things together in perfect unity. It holds everything up. It is the centerpiece of this new outfit that we have been given from God. The Bible tells us to love God first of all and most of all. The Bible tells us to love our neighbour, to love other Christians, and to love the world and the people around us. Thanks so much for watching and praying for you as God challenges you and encourages you to throw off the old self, to put to death what remains of your earthly nature, and then to clothe yourselves in the way that this passage describes. See you tomorrow.